world of cable news screaming and social media echo chambers, it's easy to lose the signal in the noise. Every day, policy is debated, votes are cast, and your tax dollars are spent. We cut through the headlines to bring you the critical context you need, focusing on what's really going on in news and politics. Welcome to the Analytical Iowan Podcast. This is your daily dose of fact-driven politics. Let's analyze today's news. Here's Eric.
And we are back here on the Analytical Iowan Podcast. It is Friday, February 27th, as I am recording this. And of course, we've got a lot to talk about because there's always a lot to talk about. Now, yesterday's podcast, working on getting it uploaded. I had recorded it, I had it sitting out there, and didn't even notice till I sat down to record this that it had stalled, and I'm trying to get that pushed through. So hopefully that'll be up, maybe even before this one gets up. That'll be up, maybe even before I'm done recording this. I don't know yet. But gonna get this up and posted as soon as I can. May end up being into the early morning hours of Saturday. Now, recording this later than I would have liked, the day got away from me with work and everything else, as I've talked about before. I have to hold down a full-time job on top of, doing this and making content. And I'm glad to make the content, to talk you guys through all of the problems we have going on, because there's always so much going on. There's a lot of nuance and intricacies, and there's a lot of fear because people are afraid. And one of the things that gets me, and I talked about it over on the Rational Boomer podcast. Now, yesterday I mentioned, and you guys didn't get to see it yet, at least not as of my recording this because it was stalled. But I mentioned on yesterday's podcast that I was today's guest. I was Friday's guest on the Rational Boomer podcast. Now, I encourage you to go check out the Rational Boomer podcast. If you have not seen Friday's episode yet, encourage you to go check it out. It was a good show. Mike and I talked for like an hour and a half. We covered a lot of things, but one of the things we talked about was this fear of Donald Trump. Donald Trump says a lot of things. He does. He comes out and he could say the most outlandish and bizarre shit, and everybody gets all worked up. Oh my God, it's going to happen. Oh my God, it's going to happen. He came out and he said he was going to issue this strong executive order citing a national emergency, and he was going to require photo ID, and he was going to end mail-in balloting for the midterm elections. Yet he had already tried that early in this term. Courts told him, go fuck yourself. It doesn't work that way. That is not part of your powers. Well, today somebody must have got to him because he issues a statement, or he was asked by reporters, I think, if he was going to do it. And he said he doesn't think he's going to do that before the midterms now. So either he now thinks he is going to win the midterms, which if he does, he's delusional. I think he's more terrified of losing the midterms than anything, because he knows if he loses the midterms, he is probably going to get impeached for a third time. Now, I can already hear people in the comments typing it out saying, well, he got impeached twice his first term. It didn't prevent anything. There's a difference here compared to the other two. What should have been his final impeachment and a conviction in 2021 for an insurrection against the United States wasn't, because for the most part, Mitch McConnell was a spineless senator. He took the easy way out and said, oh, look, we are going to be, he's out of office. We can pass it off. We can say it's a criminal matter and the DOJ can fix our problem. And he really hoped that the DOJ was going to just fix their Donald Trump problem. And they didn't. He expected Merrick Garland to do the job that he was appointed to do, which was run the DOJ and investigate crime. and have an investigation into everything surrounding January 6th. And for the most part, Merrick Garland did, until it got into the upper echelon of people. Once we started looking at it, could be uh, sitting members of Congress, senators, the wife of a Supreme Court justice, or a former president, and people like that, Merrick Garland sat on his hands and did nothing. Why? Because he deemed it a political problem. He said, well, that's not my problem. That is a political thing. It shouldn't be handled in the criminal justice system because we have to handle it politically. Now, that's a dumb move if you ask me, but that's how Merrick Garland chose to characterize it. And Mitch McConnell was hoping Merrick Garland would have said, let's go after him. But Merrick Garland didn't. So if Donald Trump gets impeached again, there's multiple ways this could play out. First of all, there is the way where uh, he gets impeached before the midterms while Republicans are still in control of the House of Representatives. Or it's maybe just slightly after the midterms, but before the Democrats take back over in January, at least in the House of Representatives. I'm fairly confident that the Democrats take the House. Less confident about the Senate, but I think the Senate is at least in play. It is going to be a fight, but there is an outside chance that the Democrats take the House of or take the Senate rather. I think it's a foregone conclusion they get the House. It's just a matter of by how many seats. Well, what what I think could happen is if before January 3rd, when the new Congress is seated, what could happen here is that if the Republicans move on him anytime between now and that January 3rd deadline of the new Congress, I think it's a foregone conclusion that he is ousted 110%. Why? Because the Republicans wouldn't move it one of their own. They wouldn't if they didn't think they could actually succeed. And I think, and I've been talking about it for a while, I think they are having closed door meetings, that they are having these discussions behind closed doors, weighing the math and seeing what happens. Now, why would this be different than his first two impeachments? Well, this would be the Republicans leading the charge against one of their own. And why would they do that? Well, two reasons. One, they could do it before the midterms if they think that it would help their chances at winning those midterms, or they could do them after the midterms when we know the result and we have a ton of members of Congress that no longer have seats. Let's say, for sake of argument, let's say 30 members of the House of Representatives have lost their seats to Democrats. And there's 30 members of the Republican Party that are not seeking re-election anyway. Those 30, let's say all 30 of those seats end up flipping. Now, there's going to be a Democrat taking their spot. All right, cool. They have nothing to lose. They're out of politics. Now, what happens when it goes to the Senate? Well, again, let's say the Democrats take the Senate. Okay, they get just the majority. They get to 51. Well, they know that majority's coming, right? And the Republicans are now worried that they're going to get wiped out even worse in 2028 if they don't do something. So again, what do they have to lose? They move on Donald Trump. They try to set up JD Vance and give a favorable narrative going into 28. Now, it's not going to work because JD Vance is not very well liked. He's not liked by MAGA. He's not liked by Republicans. He's not liked by independents. He's not liked by Democrats. He was a pick of convenience that Donald Trump was talked into picking. And I think in part Donald Trump was talked into picking it because nobody expected Donald Trump to win. I don't think the Republicans expected him to win. I think, and especially if you look at all of the metrics going into the 2024 election, everybody expected Donald Trump to lose. I think they were just trying to use Donald Trump and they thought if they caught lightning in a bottle a second time and he somehow won, he would be their useful idiot and they could do whatever they want. And for the most part, they've been right. At least this is my take. Um, Now, what I think could happen with this impeachment, why it is different and why Donald Trump is terrified, is if it's Republican led either before the midterms or after, before the Democrats take back over, it's almost guaranteed to go through. But a third one, led by Democrats, still has a good chance of going through. Now, why is that? Well, that would be because, at least in my mind, if you ask me about it, I would say uh, Donald Trump has nothing left. He's a lame duck. He doesn't have an election to run. He can't run in 28, despite his multiple claims and multiple reasons as to why he thinks he deserves a third term. He does not. The Constitution says no, you don't get a third term, but he believes he should have one. So what happens? He's got nothing left to give the Republicans. If the Democrats have a good enough reason to levy against him for an impeachment, and the Democrats aren't going to use impeachment the way the Republicans did. Remember, Joe Biden hadn't even been president more than a few minutes, and Marjorie Taylor Greene was already trying to introduce articles of impeachment against Joe Biden for nothing more than winning the election. It was well, you impeached our guy, we'll impeach yours, tit for tat. It didn't work. They never had the votes, and Democrats were in control of the House of Representatives when she tried it. But they tried again when Republicans had control of the House of Representatives, and Joe Biden was never impeached. Why? Because they didn't have this small little thing called evidence. Now, I expect that if the Democrats were to impeach Donald Trump a second time, or a third time rather, and this is what Donald Trump is terrified of, that because he has nothing left to give, A, they're going to have evidence. B, Republicans have nothing else to gain from Donald Trump at that point. And Donald Trump, who is transactional in everything he does, he is going to see the balance sheet of this and go, "Oh shit, I've got nothing left to give him. I could be in trouble." And that's why he is so terrified. Now, he says he is not going to declare a national emergency ahead of the election. And I think that is because somebody got to him and told him basically Republicans will move against you if you try to fuck this up too bad. They're trying to pass the SAVE Act, and that SAVE Act, as much as people are terrified of it, it is not going to pass the Senate. It is DOA. In fact, two of the things that they were talking about doing to try to pass it, John Thune said, "Yeah, we're not doing that. We don't have the support to make it happen." One of the things they wanted to do was to go back to what is called a talking filibuster. Now, if you want a good movie about how the talking filibuster works, go watch Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And effectively, what the talking filibuster was is you would say, you would recognize Senator Kelly, for example. So the senator from Arizona is recognized. Mark Kelly would get to the floor, and he would talk for as long as he could possibly hold out. Now, sometimes that's 12, 14 hours, 20 hours, whatever that number is. And then they would yield the floor back, and then the next person would get up. And that might be Adam Schiff. And then the Democrats would basically have to keep talking until nobody could go anymore. And there would be limits as to how often people could get up and talk and things like that. And then once everybody had basically said everything they could say with the talking filibuster, well, then they would move forward to voting on it, and they could pass it that way. But John Thune says they don't have the votes to enforce that kind of a rule, so they're not going to do that. The other thing they could do is they could nuke the filibuster. Now, what the filibuster is in part what we were just talking about, where you could have to talk and talk and talk and talk to end debate on a bill. The other thing with the filibuster is connected to this rule where you must have 60 votes to agree to end debate and move forward to a final vote. That's why when they say they don't have the votes to pass the filibuster, the bill dies, right? Now, what can happen with a vote to move forward, you could have potentially, especially in votes that aren't as serious as the SAVE Act, you could have 60 votes to end debate and move forward to a final vote, and you could still have the vote pass. I mean, it could pass with 50, or because JD Vance is the tie-breaking vote, and he would, of course, vote in favor of whatever the Republicans or Donald Trump wants. But you wouldn't have to have 60 votes to pass the legislation just to get to that, past that threshold to get to the final vote. But they don't have the votes in the Senate to get rid of the filibuster. Now, why don't they have the votes? Because the Senate is a long-term body. Okay? Your senators are elected for 6 years. And I've heard people complain that 6 years is too long. It should be shorter. It should be more like the House of Representatives every 2 years. And you're missing the point if you think that. Okay. The Senate is set up on a 6 year rotation, and they are a longer term body to be more deliberative. The House passes a whole shit ton of stuff every Congress that gets to the Senate and then dies. Why? Well, the House passes it because they have to answer to the people. The House of Representatives, in its entirety, all 435 voting members, plus all of the ones for other areas like Puerto Rico and DC and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Yes, the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Guam, and DC all have members of the House of Representatives. They just don't have voting members. But they have people there that can be recognized, they can talk, they can suggest things, but they cannot suggest legislation. They would have to work in conjunction with somebody else to propose legislation. But anyway, all 435 plus the territories in DC and everything, all of those members of the House of Representatives get elected every 2 years. Basically, from the day they win their election, they are already in re-election mode because they're on the clock. They are very answerable to the people because they have to go back. You know, we are already in primary season, right? We are 14 months into this Congress. The people that are running for re-election in November still have 10 months left, basically, until their term is up. And they're already running for re-election. It's not so much with the Senate. The Senate, for example, those members that get elected this coming November, the 33, I think, maybe 34 senators that are up for grabs this election, they would not be up for re-election now until 2032. They are not as answerable to the people. It's a longer process. It's a slower process for them for re-election. So they can afford to be more deliberative. They can afford to be calmer because they can defend, 6 years from now, the SAVE Act is probably going to be a distant memory. And they're not going to have to run on potentially a re-election campaign of I voted to block the SAVE Act or I voted to pass the SAVE Act, especially if it never passes Congress at all. No one's going to remember it in 6 years. That's why the Senate is more deliberative. And they are looking at the filibuster going, the future's coming. We can see it. Now, if the Democrats gain control of the Senate in 2026, here in November, where they would take over effectively in January, but you know what I mean. If that happens, what the Republicans are going to want to use the filibuster. It is the thing the minority party loves. It lets them block what the majority is doing and have their input. The filibuster is one of the reasons we do not have the public option on the Affordable Care Act. The Democrats wanted to have effectively Medicare for all included in the Affordable Care Act, but they couldn't get past the filibuster. So Republicans are already saying we don't have the votes to kill the filibuster because the Republican senators are looking forward, going, we're fucked. We're fucked if we're the minority. We don't want to let the Democrats get control. Now, one of the things they are looking at is the same thing I've been saying. They are looking worst case scenario toward 2028, assuming JD Vance is the Republican nominee and you have a Democrat. They're probably saying JD Vance is losing to any Democrat because the writing's on the wall. If the Democrats have a president, they have the House, because I'm assuming they're going to get the House in November and probably keep it going into 28. And they flip the Senate, and if the Senate has gotten rid of the filibuster, they can push through whatever they want. Imagine that. Imagine a Senate where they don't have to worry about the filibuster and you have a Democrat in control. They can pass Medicare for all. They could pass universal basic income. They could codify Roe v. Wade. There are so many options, and the Republicans are terrified of that. They know what could happen. Senate Republicans are saying to Donald Trump, we're not doing that. Now, beyond that, when it comes to the SAVE Act, there was a big key piece of Donald Trump's legislation that is not in the SAVE Act. What is it? He wanted an end to all mail in voting, with the exception of those that are actually disabled, old, or elderly, and the military, basically. And he said, well, and we'll even allow you to vote by mail if you're on vacation or something like that. It is a logistical nightmare to actually implement, and it's not the way elections work. States run elections. Now, the federal government gets to set the date, which is typically the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And why is it the first Tuesday after the first Monday? It goes way back to when we were a rural society, when we were mostly farming based. And you'd have to go home and deal with the crops, you'd have to go home and deal with the harvest, etc. And that was a time when politicians wouldn't be, you know, the harvest would be over and all of that, and there would be time to go vote. There was downtime then. It made sense. It wasn't as busy for people, and it was still before the weather got too bad where voting was going to be a problem. But as far as there are some other requirements as far as who can be eligible to vote. And the Constitution right now very clearly says you can be 18 to vote. Why is it 18? Well, it is 18 because they passed a constitutional amendment. They passed the constitutional amendment because of Vietnam. During Vietnam, one of the things that was protested for, and actually we convinced Congress was a good idea, was that we could draft kids at 18. They could go over, fight, and die for this country in Vietnam, but they couldn't vote for the people that were sending them there. And it made sense. Now, there were some other things that changed with the voting age. They tried for a little while to make the drinking age 18, and they ended up having to raise it back up to 21 because they were finding out that it was getting alcohol in the schools. But for a while, they tried it, but it just didn't work out. But as far as who can vote, only U.S. citizens can vote. That's always been a thing. So the SAVE Act doesn't change anything with that. They just try to add a level of complexity. But they wanted to put a bunch of restrictions on how states run elections. But the Constitution says states handle the manner of their elections. If one state wanted to basically say, okay, here's how we're doing it, we're renting out a big auditorium, and everybody from the state's got to show up to the auditorium, and we're gonna, do handwritten ballots and like you would voting for your class president in high school, then that's legal. That's how the state chooses to do it. It's impractical and you can't really be done because there's not really one building big enough for the entire state population, especially with a state like California. But the point is, states get to choose how they do elections. That's why you have some states that close their polls at 7, some close them at 8, some close them at 9, some start at 7 a.m., some start at 6 a.m., I think. All of that changes based on what state you're in. It also changes how many days of early voting access do you get. I think Oregon and Washington State, I believe, have universal mail-in voting. That is the only way you do it. There isn't an actual voting day where you go to a polling location. I don't think. They may have that. I'm not 100% sure, but either way, your states decide. And Republicans have used that to their advantage. Like here in Iowa, I've talked about it several times. They changed how early voting works. They shortened it by like 7 days. So you had fewer days to go vote early in person. They made it harder to get an absentee ballot mailed to you. And by changing some of those rules on a state to state basis, it allows the state to have some individual control over what works best, but it also sets up some problems. Remember, during the 2020 election, Texas was suing Pennsylvania over how it conducted its election, and that goes against the Constitution. But they tried to pass the SAVE Act, and it's not going to go anywhere out of the House or out of the Senate. It passed the House, but even the version that passed the House does not have the no mail-in ballot provision that Donald Trump wanted. Why? Because they knew they couldn't get it through. They knew they couldn't get it through the House if they had it involved, and they know it's going to hurt their own voters. A large section of the baby boomers, which are all effectively retirement age at this point, vote Republican. And a lot of them will vote by mail, despite Donald Trump wanting to claim that there is something wrong with it. And the only reason Donald Trump is pushing so hard against mail-in balloting, well, it's twofold, but they both come from the same thing. One, he blames mail-in balloting for his loss in the 2020 general election. He's still hurt, and his ego is still hurt that he lost 2020, and he blames mail-in voting. But two, going into 2020, he was so against mail-in voting because the Democrats were pushing it. And he was afraid that by agreeing and pushing for more mail-in balloting, that all it would do is get more Democrats to vote against him. And because the Democrats pushed mail-in voting and the mail-in voting, because they made it easy, more people who voted Democratic voted against Donald Trump, he's got a problem with it. This is all about soothing his ego more than anything. Now, Donald Trump is trying to say he deserves a third term. So Donald Trump was giving remarks in Texas. Yeah, I was just looking this up to make sure I get it correct here for those of you watching it over on YouTube. Uh, he says maybe we should do one more term. Should we do one more term? And the crowd of supporters who gathered to hear him speak cheered. He claimed he was entitled to a third term because Democrats cheated like hell during his first re-election campaign in 2020. We actually would be entitled to it. Now, here's the thing. He's got about 3 years left of this term. And I've been talking about it a lot. I don't think he has 3 years left in him. He may not have 3 months left in him, realistically. He's not in good health. But he has to keep this third term narrative alive because he knows being president is the only thing keeping him out of prison. He's terrified of what's coming up with the Epstein files, and it keeps him relevant. The minute he starts talking about not running in 2028 and comes out and names a successor, he's a lame duck. He's no longer important. He wants to keep the focus on himself for as long as he possibly can. That is just who he is. And no, he is not entitled to a third term. He claims the Democrats cheated in 2020, but he's never provided any evidence. Now, you'll have MAGAs come up and say, well, the courts didn't listen to any of the evidence. No, what happened was those courts, the attorneys stood there and said, well, we don't have any proof of fraud, or we're not alleging fraud, but we want you to stop the recounts, or we want you to grant us a do-over, or whatever. They never provided any proof of anything because the attorneys knew if they said anything that was so far categorically untrue that they could be facing repercussions like losing their law licenses. And several of his attorneys did, including Rudy Giuliani. Now, uh, Donald Trump is never entitled to a third term. He thinks because he lost 2020, and again, he claims that the Democrats cheated, but they didn't, that somehow entitles him to a third term. These are just the whinings of somebody whose ego can't take it. But as I was saying, he keeps talking about this third term that he's entitled to or that he's owed as if it's some kind of thing. It doesn't erase the 22nd Amendment. 22nd Amendment is very clear. It says no person shall be elected to the office of president more than twice. But see that if he admits it and he steps aside, he loses some relevance and he doesn't like that. If he sets it up so that he names JD Vance the successor to MAGA, suddenly people are looking at 28. They're talking about JD Vance's chances of getting elected, etc. And it takes the focus off Donald Trump, and he doesn't like it. Now, I mentioned Donald Trump trying to stay out of prison with the Epstein files. And something happened today with the Epstein files that we need to talk about. And that was the deposition of Bill Clinton. Now, they grilled Bill Clinton for a few hours, and it worked out about how I expected. Now, we don't have the transcript yet. We don't know the entirety of it, but they pulled up multiple pictures from the files of Bill Clinton at varying events um, involving Jeffrey Epstein. And one of the things they talked about in there was there's a picture of Bill Clinton in a hot tub or a jacuzzi with a woman whose face is redacted. They asked him point blank, did you have sex with her? He said no. In fact, he couldn't remember who she was, but knows he didn't. And apparently they pulled other photos that were from the files and elsewhere, asking him about all of it, and he denied every bit of it and how he was under oath. From what I understand from the reporting I've seen, Bill Clinton did not plead the fifth at all. Now, I had to pull this up real quick. Bill Clinton testified on Friday that Donald Trump told him in the early 2000s at a golf tournament that Trump had a falling out with Jeffrey Epstein over a land deal. Three sources familiar with the testimony told CNN. That's where I'm getting this from. Now, I know MAGA is going to tell me, oh, it's CNN, whatever. Well, this seems to correlate that it will help Donald Trump. According to Clinton, Trump said he was no longer friends with Epstein. According to these sources, it was the former president who volunteered this recollection of the conversation without being asked. Now, there was multiple hours of testimony from Bill Clinton, and he mentioned Donald Trump by name. But at least in this clip or this snippet, sounds like he didn't say anything bad about Donald Trump. Now, I suggested, and I guarantee if he would have said it, we would have probably heard about it by now, and I haven't seen anything where it was said. I suggested it would be hilarious if Bill Clinton came out and admitted to being Bubba. Now, from what I've seen, that hasn't happened. And if you don't know the story I'm talking about, there's apparently an email in there in the Epstein files where Epstein is talking to, I believe it was his brother, and basically asked if the Russians still have the photo of Donald Trump blowing Bubba. And the speculation immediately arose when that came out that Bill Clinton was Bubba. And I was talking about how funny it would be if that ended up being true. Well, uh, from what I can see, Bill Clinton never said that. Now, he testified for hours. And from what I've gathered from the bits I've read, um, he never pled the fifth, answered all the questions, which is what you would expect. However, Democrats came out during one of the breaks, and the Democrats that were there made a very poignant observation. Precedent has now been set. This is one of the first times, if not the first time, a former president has been subpoenaed by Congress. Now, that means when the Democrats are in control, guess what they get to do? Presuming he lives that long, they can subpoena Donald Trump. They've subpoenaed a former first lady. Guess what? Republicans, we get to subpoena Melania Trump. Now, this precedent had already been set last Congress in the last half of Joe Biden's term. But guess what? They subpoenaed the child of a sitting president, not a former president, a sitting president. So guess what? Guess who else could get deposed in connection to the Epstein files when the Democrats have control again? You could have Eric Trump, Don Jr., Ivanka, Tiffany sitting there having to testify before Congress. And imagine MAGA or Donald Trump losing their ever loving minds because they get deposed. It's fine when you do it to Bill Clinton. It's fine when it's Hunter Biden. But you touch somebody with the last name Trump and they're going to lose their minds. Now, what could any of those have to tell? Who knows? Donald Trump would have a lot to say, and the thing about Donald Trump, and one of the reasons why he doesn't want to testify under oath about any of this, is he would have to tell the truth, or he'd have to plead the fifth. Now, Donald Trump says that only guilty people plead the fifth, which isn't true. And just to clarify, the Fifth Amendment says you do not have to give testimony or bear witness against yourself for any crimes that you have been accused or anything like that. What does that mean? Well, the prosecution in a court case, for example, cannot call you to testify, and they cannot make you answer questions. Now, the defense in a trial could call you and you could testify. Usually that's a very dumb thing to do. But one of the reasons, and you hear people say, I plead the fifth all the time. You have the right to remain silent. You don't have to speak and answer questions if it could incriminate you. And one of the problems with that is that it's often, like Donald Trump says, it's associated with guilt. Okay, you plead the fifth, you are often presumed guilty. Well, what does that mean in the case of this? You can't presume somebody is guilty because they plead the fifth. And one of the reasons somebody might plead the fifth is that their words may be taken out of maybe context, misconstrued. They could potentially say something in a way that doesn't mean exactly what they intended, and saying nothing is the better option. But Donald Trump does not want to testify in this matter because he's going to have to plead the fifth. And he knows how bad publicly that would look, especially now that the Clintons have testified for for hours anyway, in public, and they did not plead the fifth. He knows it would look bad. Who else could have something to say? Melania. It has been rumored for a long time that Melania met Donald Trump through Epstein, and that could have to be confirmed. Now, they don't want to do any of that. They don't want to have to deal with that at all. That it would be something that they would want to keep secret if they could. Beyond that, there are talks of other emails, including ones that look to be from Ghislaine Maxwell to Melania, I think, or vice versa, around the time Donald Trump won. She may have to answer for it. And there have been all kinds of questions surrounding whether or not any of the Trump kids went to the island. Also, there have been questions for a while about the relationship between Ivanka and Donald. Now, you may say I'm reaching there, but Donald himself said during an interview, and Ivanka looked kind of weird or nervous a little bit when he said it. He made a comment about how pretty she was, and if she wasn't his daughter, that she would be dating him. She was barely 18, if I remember right, when he made those comments. It was just very bizarre, and we don't know the gist of everything surrounding that. Now, it meant nothing, and it just maybe he was just commenting more about how pretty she was, and that was his type. But it's still a weird thing to say about your daughter. Any of them could be fair game to be deposed with the Epstein files. Now, one of the reasons Donald Trump ran for office was to stay out of prison. He was worried about the Epstein files closing in on him. He was worried about Jack Smith with the classified documents case, even though that was in front of his pet judge, Aileen Cannon, who did everything in her power to help him. He was worried about the January 6th charges that were coming in D.C. in front of Judge Tanya Chutkan, who was a no nonsense judge who wouldn't have let Donald Trump get away with all of the bullshit he had gotten away with in other cases. There were the criminal charges coming in Georgia. He had his 34 felony convictions in the state of New York, where he had sentencing hanging over his head. Donald Trump was running to stay out of prison. He talks about running for a third term to stay out of prison. Beyond being relevant, he desperately wants a third term. I think he knows on some levels that his health is not good enough to make it maybe to the end of this term. And I think on the far side, he's convinced he's going to survive till 2029. But he's wanting another term past this beyond. So I don't think he is expecting to live to 32 to 2032 if he were to be able to run. And I said all along he is not eligible to run. But I think one of the things he is looking at is, well, if I can get that third term, if I can get a third term somehow and I can run to 2032, I might not live that long, even though that would be a big admission for him, knowing how he thinks about himself, that he thinks dying in office of the president would be way better than to die in prison. He is desperate to stay out of prison by any means necessary. Now, Donald Trump's health is not good. We've been talking about it. And the more we talk about it, the worse it's going to get, the worse his appetite is. I mean, did you see he had the U.S. men's hockey team into the White House to celebrate their earning gold, winning the gold medal? He didn't, he invited the women secondhand, or as an afterthought, I should say. He wasn't going to invite them. And then when he was talking with the U.S. men's team, he's like, "Oh, I guess I better invite the women because what they would say about me if I didn't." So he invites them. They turn him down. They were partying in Vegas, from what I saw, uh, having a fancy dinner, lobster and steaks and that kind of stuff. What does the men's team get when they show up to the White House? And not the entire team showed up. I don't remember which players didn't, but several of them chose not to because of having to get back to their respective hockey teams. But they chose not to, or because they didn't want to be associated with Donald Trump, one of the two. He serves them a banquet of McDonald's. McDonald's, really. And we find out, we've heard about this before. Donald Trump prefers McDonald's over getting a chef catered meal. because in his dementia-ridden, Adderall-ridden, you know, half-gone brain that he's got left, he thinks it makes more sense to get food from McDonald's daily because he trusts it more. He claims it's safer than eating, you know, chef prepared meals because he is so convinced somebody is out to get him that he thinks it is safer that way. The reality is, you know, we've all been at McDonald's. We've all ordered McDonald's. We've seen some of the stuff that comes through there, you know, and who knows what potentially could happen. But it's one of the things. Donald Trump is not in his right mind. Some of the creators I follow on TikTok talk about dementia care. And this would be something you would deal with in dementia care. You would talk them through it. You would, oh, I don't trust home cooked meals anymore. It's got to be McDonald's. It's safer. That sounds like something somebody suffering from dementia would say. And you have to find a way to redirect them. But the problem is, you got Donald Trump. His ego won't let you redirect him. And he's surrounded himself by yes men who can't find it in him to tell them no. Donald Trump is ridiculous. And he's not doing well mentally or anything else. And the problem is the people around him, including his own kids and his own family, are not stepping in to help him. They are letting him go down with the ship because they don't want to deal with him being mad about them trying to save him, you know. They don't want to deal with him being irritated and throwing a fit and throwing ketchup against the wall or whatever by going against him. So instead, they let his health go. Now, how much longer does he have? Who knows? Could be 2 months. Could be by the end of the year. And honestly, with as much high pressure things as we have going on right now, the more stress he gets under, the quicker it's probably going to happen. You have the Epstein files closing in on him. If one of these other areas that are doing all of these investigations into him releases something to the public, that's going to add to his mental strain. You have England looking into former Prince Andrew and what they may uncover. You have France doing investigations. I think Germany's doing investigations. We found out that there is reports in the Epstein files of the former Zorro Ranch that has now been bought by somebody who knew both Epstein and is a big Trump supporter. That there may be bodies buried on or near Zorro Ranch, and that New Mexico is looking into the allegations. As all of these investigations continue, and Donald Trump feels the weight of all of this going on, it is going to be bad for him mentally. He's not going to know what to do. He's going to start becoming more and more frantic, more and more afraid, and it is going to exasperate the conditions already going on. His mental state is going to get worse. It wouldn't surprise me if in the coming weeks we hear about him taking another cognitive test. On one of the past podcasts, I went through and I read you the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the thing he talks about being a an IQ test or an aptitude test. He's referred to it as both. And he says the last few questions are very, very hard. The last few questions are things like, what day is it? What year is it? Where are you right now? And those are considered hard questions to the man running this country who wants us to believe he is a stable genius. When he says things like smart people don't like him, he's right because we can see through him. We see him for what he is. We see him for the fact that he is battling some kind of mental disorder, probably dementia. We see him for being the weaker person in this whole situation. Donald Trump is nowhere near as stable as he wants you to believe, and ultimately he is going to crash and burn. Now, Bill Clinton testifying before the Oversight Committee sets the stage for, if he survives, Donald Trump may be doing the same thing. Now, does that mean the Democrats are going to subpoena Donald Trump and add to hit the weight and all of the pressure on him when they get control again after the midterms? Probably not. I doubt they try to do it to a sitting president. But if Donald Trump somehow manages to survive everything going on around him, and I don't think he will, but if he manages to survive into 2029, expect those subpoenas to come, expect them to ask him to come sit before Congress. But by then, maybe the dementia has gotten bad enough to the point where there's nothing left, right? Now, there could come a point with Donald Trump, as we've been talking about his health, where they have to institute the 25th Amendment. And if they do, they are going to wait until they absolutely have to. They are not going to want to move on Donald Trump unless they don't have another choice, unless there is not another option. Because in the state he's in right now, he is still cognitively aware enough that he is able to put forward a defense, right? He will be able to counterattack and hit back and punch back against those that have turned against him. And the Republicans don't want that. What they want to do is make a turn on him so that they can make a clean break and start moving forward. And when they do, they will shift to JD Vance, and then JD Vance will be given specific instructions to right the ship. And they want to do that without interference from Donald Trump. So their hope is that something happens soon. At least this is my take, that they are hoping something happens soon so that Donald Trump is out of the way. And then they can go about their day about moving the party forward into a post-Trump situation. All right, that's going to do it for today's episode of the Analytical IOM podcast. Just a reminder that I was Friday's guest, today's guest over on the Rational Boomer podcast. Encourage you to go check that out. I'll be back on that podcast again sometime soon. I might do a live sometime coming up here shortly as the podcast. I like doing the lives, and I haven't done one for a little bit, so I might do a podcast that way coming up. I want to thank you for taking the time to join me today. Hope you guys have a great day, and we will be back tomorrow.
That was Eric. That does it for our analysis today. If you appreciated us cutting through the noise to get to the critical context, please make sure you're subscribed to the Analytical Iowan podcast on Spotify and YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.